Well, thanks to all the speakers this morning. All the presentations were fascinating. I'll open the floor up to comments in a minute, but I thought I'd just start by bringing up something that made me think a lot, and that's his comment on the need to engage with creators earlier. I thought was something really significant. You know, creators who often are early in the career, before they perspective on their own career, what their legacy will be. Perhaps some of the architects in the audience can speak to this, but I wonder, again to borrow from Inés, if architects who are digital natives might have greater awareness of the need to manage digital records proactively. But in any case, how do you suggest that we start this conversation? How do we convince architects that this work is in their own interest? We're asking them maybe to do more work now than we did before when they just had them shove all their papers in a box. So, thoughts from the speakers?
I think one of the things. Oh, you want to start? Go ahead.
One of the things is exactly that, the issue that collecting institutions, or at least in cultural institutions, we receive the files once the process is basically at the end. One of the issues with the Harvard Planning Office, and that's why I gave those standards, is that they are actually the ones commissioning projects, so they can set those standards. Architects, if they want to work for Harvard for their buildings, they have to produce these. So it's easy if you have standards that others have to apply. However, if in our case at the Graduate School of Design, we're a historical archive, so once the files are received by us, they've been around many years. And that's why you have to work together with architectural offices, and ideally architectural offices would have CAD managers and people who are enforcing naming conventions, layer conventions, things of that sort.
I was going to say pretty much the same thing, and I think that David's comment was an extremely good one, that there's this dark ages when the architects themselves are kind of struggling with how to do this, but the nature of architecture as a profession really is to have a product that's shared broadly across different professions, and in some ways I think it's a problem that's getting way better rather than worse, and that we as archivists we don't have the ability to affect really the direction that software goes and so on. But when architects themselves are insisting on standard formats, and the great aha moment for us in our archives was when the architects said, well, we had to learn how to work with records that are in PDF. In other words, we didn't say, you've got to do PDF. Mm-hmm. It was an external force, but of course then it was exactly the direction that we needed to go. So I'm actually more optimistic now than I was a few years ago that there will be solutions here.
Well, that's good to hear. Are there any architects in the audience that would want to speak to that, whether there is an awareness in the field of the importance to keeping these records and working with archives?
I just have to say, it was very interesting to hear you ask that question, actually, because it does there are parallels with what the work the DCC is doing with researchers in universities, because they too are now being pressured into organising their digital data better in order to respond to funder mandates, and there is a great deal of resistance that we have to overcome. But we have arguments like the funder mandates to fall back on. We have arguments about the importance of the reusability of digital data, and about how research needs to be made more transparent and therefore needs to have better documentation so that it's so that it's easier for peer researchers to be able to review the work that they've done. So I'm very interested to hear what kind of arguments can be brought to bear on architects when the culture and the context is not quite the same.
Well, obviously the relationship of the archive to the creator matters too, because in Inés's case, this is the universities employing architects to do work, so they can say we need this, but many institutions are collecting architectural firms that have no relation to them, and they're coming to them and asking them to not only hand over their records, which is difficult, I know, for some institutions, especially more modern work, but also asking them to do more work in some cases. So, are there any questions from the floor, general questions for any of the speakers?
Hi, I'm Christopher Marston from the Victoria Albert Museum. I've got a question for Inés. I was very interested to hear your description of Harvard's digital repository service, and particularly interested to know that they have decided that they can't manage all this out at the moment, but they are prepared to store files of that kind without actually knowing how they're going to be preserved in the long term. But I wonder, is there any sense amongst you and your colleagues of how long that position might last, and how much of this stuff you're going to accumulate before you have the answers? Or, I mean, or are you really just like the rest of us, hoping for the best?
Right. No. What we're doing right now in terms of things that have permanent value and that we have committed to preserve, for example, digital theses of students, we are putting those in PDF right now, PDFA. Because we know that is something that the DRS can actually commit to their long-term preservation. In terms of AutoCAD files, we're exploring this with a Facade 2 project, but we don't yet know how Facade 2 is going to speak or not with DRS. So the reality is that for AutoCAD drawings, they're telling us that we should put them in as opaque objects, and at some point they will be able to grab them and do something with them. But yeah, the current thing is for student theses, we're putting in a PDFA because we know it's reliable. Or sort of reliable. More reliable than AutoCAD. And then the others, the opaque objects, what it actually does is you add metadata to it. So there's descriptive metadata documentation that Alex talked about. There's additional information that will allow you to work with that content at a later stage. DRS2 started in 2009. I was going to launch in 2011. It's now going to be launched at the end of this year. So it's taking more time than we expected and more funding than we expected.
And as DRS is an internal system.
It's an internal. It's the Digital Repository Service of Harvard University, and DRS2 is now.
Eventually will be its successor.
Right. Yeah.
I have a question for all of you because you brought the word up. First of all, I'd like to mention that David mentioned the study that he and Eleanor Bourne and a number of others worked on, which resulted in a very good series. It's about a 49-page document, which are guidelines to beginning to think about how to manage these electronic records by working with firms. We weren't able to print that out because we're trying to be green and proper, but we are, anyone who's interested, please come up to me because we can email you a copy of that. And I don't know, is that paper still available on the internet?
I was wondering.
We have a good copy of it, so.
I think it is. I think it is available. There was an internet a website of Gaudi Archives that disappeared at some point, and so it was translated into 6 languages, I think, these guidelines. And I think that not all the versions still exist, but you have it in English, we have it in French, and I think it should be found on our website of the Cité de l'Architecture, and you should put it on the...
We'd like to put it on our website, but
yeah,
we'll also
that's the only way to give access to it.
One of the things it does talk about, which I think is a really key thing, is the word selection and appraisal. That is still a part of the job that archivists bring to the table. And one of the real challenges is going into a firm and actually developing a relationship where the people are comfortable enough to allow you to do the selection and pricing process. And in fact, I should mention a lady who is no longer with us, Laura Tatum, who was at the Canadian Center for Architecture, did a very interesting paper at the last ICAM meeting around what she called pre-custodial intervention, which is this long word meaning you develop a relationship and you go in and work with the firms. And her subtitle was very telling. We're not against the firms. We are actually trying to work with the firms. And it's really important, but I'd like to raise something with you because it's a dilemma for me personally. We always had a historical time lag that allowed us to be comfortable in collecting things. Part of that was predicated on would they be significant enough in the test of time for us to expend the energy to actually collect the stuff. But another component to this is the liability issues that revolve around projects, because when a project is finished, there are liability terms for how long materials need to be retained in toto in case there's any kind of a legal action. This still exists, and in fact, with our Dennis Lasden collection, Charles Hyde, our curator of drawings, was very cognizant of this. And in fact, when you look at that collection, it's coming in portions, with the final portions released once the liability term was over. Now, with digital records, we can go in now and start collecting things. And for me, one of the legal questions is, how do we handle the liability?
Embargoes on the files.
But also, what's the problem for me is more fundamental. If we are agreeing to archive this permanently, then we're agreeing to provide access to something in the long run. And if we're not sure that we can get back to the native CAD format files or any of that original documentation, if we take that in as this is where we've got to be really clear. If we're collecting in the digital age, we never, in the old days, I remember we never claimed to be the legal repository for a firm because of the selection process. There was a selection made of what was considered to be historically valuable, so that if some sort of lawsuit happened, you weren't put in a position of having to provide all the records. And so my question is as well with the selection process, it's something when we're collecting things that are still under liability or within kind of live, the digital thing allows the fact that duplicates can exist, so that's great. And what is the original object? But it's just an issue that I think we have to be mindful of. And I just threw that out because I wondered if any of you have had any experiences of thinking about that.
You know, what I'd observe is that the firms have absolutely the same problem, or in our case, the architect's office and the engineers and everybody that provides it, that we have providing access, and native CAD files simply are not accessible. I mean, you know, very long. And what, Alex, what do you think is the time frame? You know, sometimes I think it's like 6 months, and you know, and the liability period is considerably longer than that. Yeah, and the CAD files are not going to be usable for that too. So then there becomes this other legal framework. But it does seem to me that in itself, I would resist taking legal responsibility for anybody else's problems, just as a basic rule of life. But having said that, the firm is going to be facing so much the same problem. So I see all of these things kind of tending together to really help from an archival point of view. Again, it was telling to me that our architect's office decided themselves to eliminate XREFs. You know, that was one of the big things about, you know, the broken links and things. Well, that was this major headache, and they realized themselves that they could not, they couldn't expect to maintain those links over time. So they changed their practice. And again, I think that's the real hope. And in fact, maybe liability is going to be one of the things you're grateful for. Kurt, we'll wait and see.
Okay.
Because, you know, they have to defend themselves too.
What if you were paid to look after these things? Or if it was a service you provided, would you think differently then? So you're not keen to take on that liability, but what if it was a service you could provide?
I think I'd get insurance.
Well,
Yeah. Well, I think that's another point, though, which is that the complexities are very, very costly for everybody, and there probably is a model for a sort of a third party to provide that.
Because that's obviously a shared copy.
Well, this is it, because we're committed to collecting the electronic stuff, so we have a real vested interest in understanding how the things live, the way that they're saved. So obviously, we really do have to be involved in that. I think all of us are concerned that we don't know what the answers are, and pretending that we do is exactly what Maygene says. We would need to get insurance. So, yeah.
But I was really interested in when you're describing the workflow that you go through in the process of ingesting material, because as a result of that, you do actually end up with an original copy of the file as you received it.
Yes.
In the archive. So potentially, if there was a call in the future for insurance,
could.
whatever, or you could access it, or
Yeah.
if there was a failure in the bit stream further down the process, you could go back and retrieve it.
Yes. Yeah.
And that process, when you sort of harvest off the original file, is it, how do you, sort of, what's the infrastructure that underlies that? How do you, is it sort of 3 copies in different areas of the country, or is it around the campus?
Well,
How are you ensuring you're comfortable that it's being backed
the
up?
sort of the bit
Yeah.
stream. Well, two answers is that one is that we trust our IT staff, and the other is that we don't trust our IT staff. So trusting our IT staff, they are the ones theoretically responsible for the server backup and everything, and they do the sort of state-of-the-art best practice that they have servers, and they actually, records management in a traditional archival sense is much more prevalent now than it ever was, about having, they have their online things, they back them up every night, they keep them for a week on campus, they get sent off site and so on. And different businesses, I think, have different needs. Newspapers are different than museums. So we do have to trust them. But they did have a catastrophic failure. They really did. And the backup system that was supposed to be backing up our files skipped our files. So, yeah, I know, oops. So that's where our offline RAID, and these are actually quite cheap now, and it is in a physically secure room. It's in the archives, but it is within the National Gallery campus, but it's our, it's sort of like what risk management is thinking about what's most likely. And, we don't think an atom bomb is going to fall directly on us, and if it does, we have bigger worries. and we do have a lot of fire protection and things like that. So that's where we are. And, we do find ourselves sometimes going, I think of it as a rabbit hole of how much security is enough. Maybe we should have 2 offline RAID protected backups, if not, and what we finally decided is that you just have to, there's a common sense sort of basis, and we really don't want to go back to that because there's quite a lot of time and energy that goes into that processing and the renaming and so on, and so we don't ever want to have to trace backwards through our metadata to get there, but we can if we need to. Yeah.
It's a situation that we're looking at the moment, and it comes down to what's best practice as opposed to budget, and what is practical, really.
Yeah.
But I think it outlines what I've heard so far this morning is this actual process promotes collaboration across the board, which is really positive.
Yeah, exactly.
So speaking of process, Maygene, can you talk a little bit more about how your files are accessed by a user? You did mention at one point that size and format could be changed on the fly.
Yeah.
Can you just speak more about that?
I can, and actually it gives me a chance to say that one of the ideas behind this digital repository is, and again, this is very, it's clear in OAIS, that you keep the digital objects and that access is separate, and that's actually hopeful to us because the access is in fact it's difficult because there just are not software products that we're aware of that are very easy to use. So we do, and it depends whether it's textual or graphic or image files. Image files we access. We've got an off-the-shelf DAM, Digital Asset Manager, which is great for visual images. It doesn't work real well for graphics because it doesn't have the scale for the graphic things, honestly, because they're drawings that are looked at specifically. It's sort of one-on-one research. So we just actually open them directly from the server. The on-the-fly changing comes via the digital asset manager or Photoshop, and you come to love Adobe Bridge just because it does a lot of clever things, and it lets. The thing that is really terrific from our point of view is that with these very tightly controlled files, many of which are textual files, and that's one of the things about the architectural process, that we focus on graphic visual images, but in the real world it's specs and it's contracts and all that other stuff, and those are readily read on screen, but it's the context that's really important. I mean, page 5 really does need to follow page 4, and you need to be able to flip through. And so where there, I think, are evolving, it's not absolutely clear what the best practice is whether you're better off with a multi-page PDF that's slow to load and irritating to work through, but then it's all together, or are you better off with a lot of separate pages that using something clever like Adobe Bridge you go through. And that's why, in my mind, the really important thing is to separate these processes. And I really think that the access is going to change dramatically. And it entirely depends on software products that are not really within our control at all, not even close to being. So, but you see, that's why, to me, it's very important to focus on that core archival preservation package, because that's what's there.
Then I was going to say one of the discoveries of the last 5 or 6 years, I would say, is this OAIS reference model, where you separate what is the DIP from the AIP from the
exactly.
There's a submission information package, which is a SIP, and it's different than the archival one, and it's different than the dissemination one. That idea of separating this, that years ago we thought was one thing, it's actually, and that's what makes it possible to work with. Because then that you have an archival package while you're making the dissemination package available.
Right. Oh, exactly.
So that
exactly.
that was really.
I know
it's like, oh, somebody shed light on us. This was good for the archival world. We finally started to understand what we had to do.
Well, exactly. And although David was saying, well, we spent a lot of time and didn't come up with very much, the truth is that this is a really fast-moving train here, and it wasn't very long ago that we just really didn't have any idea at all, and it just has. And the reason I think that we've come to a very good point is that things seem simple now. Well, they didn't seem so simple 5 years ago.
And I think David is totally right, because firms are now committed and actively using servers with records that are organized. What I was showing you are the realities of the legacies, where you've got these collections that are a mixture of paper and digital, which will continue, but also the fact that we weren't able to get in there to save the server, for instance. There's going to be real challenges in migrating that stuff, even making it available. In reality, what we really need to be focusing on is exactly what you're saying, which is taking the stuff from the servers, to be honest with you, if you guys are able to do something with that curator's workbench, I think we probably should give you some sort of international award. That is what is needed at the end.
The nice part of the curator's workbench is the scalability it provides, because you maintain the original directory of how files were ingested or how they were. We're working on it. It's not easy.
No, it's very difficult.
Thank you.
Inés, I'm not sure if you can speak to this because I know there's some things you can't speak of, but in terms of the curator's workbench, is there a possibility it could become that magic bullet software where it does everything, ingests, preserves, it makes accessible?
I don't think so.
No.
It's in the hand of the technologists right now, to tell you the truth.
I've got a question about just the wider archives that architects create. So a number of you touched on the fact that there were just all sorts of other digital artifacts out there that architects are creating. So emails, notes and minutes, things that capture the heart of the creative process in an architect's office. And I just wondered if you could maybe just talk a little bit more broadly about sort of archiving and curating those, and how everything that we've been talking about so far, which is very much about the difficulty of dealing with new formats, many format types sort of relates to that wider creative picture. So how do you create a snapshot of that creative picture?
Well, I think much of what Maygene spoke about can be applied to almost any digital object.
Yeah, and speaking to that, it's an interesting thing that eBuilder actually does capture things like minutes, which is wonderful, and also it's terrific because it also tracks, you know, the decision points and the approvals and everything in that way. So I think it helps hugely. However, there's another side of it which is quite interesting, which is when you start focusing on what's really digital and what's not digital. And we had this long discussion because if you take a spec, which is you know, the most, well, it's common, but it's also just a very straightforward, highly structured textual document, and the little blip in the practice has been that what happens is that the specs get printed out, then people annotate the specs and say, oh no, we changed it, we didn't do that. In other words, the architects don't go back into the digital original. They're working on the analog copy, which they then redigitize and plot back into eBuilder. And of course, the problem with that is that then you look at the quality of the scan where they redigitized, and there's some, you know, edges get cut off, and in other words, the digital practice is really forcing conformity at the same time that the architects themselves are really struggling with it. It's not truly a digital system. It's really a records management system where the records are sometimes digital and they're sometimes not. Is that responsive to the?
But to an extent, I think part of my question is about significance, really.
Oh.
So a lot of what we've been talking about so far today is just the challenge of maintaining these records and giving them a continuous life cycle. But especially when you've got an archive which is increasing in size exponentially, almost year by year, as we use this technology more. From a curatorial point of view, if you've got 10,000 documents for a project like British Library, what are the 10 sort of digital masterpieces sort of within that? And how do you, as part of this process of archiving it, are we also starting to address how we use that archive to tell different stories about those projects and those practices?
This is something that was one of the issues we were tackling in the Kim and Erin project, because it was all to do with the rationale and being able to pinpoint where a particular design decision was made. So I don't have time to go through all of the different things that we looked at, but we were looking at various different techniques for mapping out the actual design process, so that you can say that these are the design minutes that correspond to this meeting. Then the designers went away and did their individual work in these different files. They came back together to another meeting, and these are the minutes for that meeting, so that you have a full auditable chain there. And we were looking at ways of mapping out the records and relating it to the process. We had things like topic maps and so on, so that you'd be able to look up which were the important documents. And once you have that map assembled, then that gives you the opportunity to be able to try and judge which are the most important things. If you have a document that's a transformation of another one, then you can say that if you've got one of them and it's a reversible transformation, then you only need to keep one of them, you don't need to keep both. So yes, it's a widespread problem, and it was something that we felt was important to address.
I should also mention that at Harvard University, the DRS, the Digital Repository Service, is also exploring in parallel how to preserve emails and how to preserve web pages. There's a program called WAX, which is the web archiving at Harvard. So in parallel, many of these things are sort of advancing slowly.
But
I-
there is, in the traditional paper world, architectural archivists have developed things called appraisal.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, those still exist, and in fact, we have them. The question is, obviously, this is why it's always so key to be working with firms, because the things in the grid change slightly. Not generally, specifications exist in both the old world and new world, but there are new things that come in, precisely as you said. To be very honest with you, this is exactly what needs to be done now. I think the appraisal grid needs to be, Laura has updated it, we need to use this in the firms to start establishing what is permanently enduring or of permanent value. We're going to have to work it out. I mean, the reality is in the paper world, we basically had the luxury of saying, right, well, we'll keep all this stuff as long as it's not duplicates, and that would weed out quite a lot of stuff. But in the electronic world, it's just, you've said it, the exponential growth is just by a factor of 100 or what have you. So it really is going to be predicated on using the appraisal grid to establish what exists, and then actually, honestly, it's going to be a case-by-case basis on the project. But that is where it's really interesting, because that is where archivists are still going to have to exist, because you're asking who is trained to bring the skills to be able to do that, and traditionally that was what we did. Yeah. So this is what we have to do in the digital world.
So those frameworks will be there, but also at the same time we're developing tools that help you deal with that amount of information. So if you have 100,000 files, there will be filters. We're trying to go through things that will be able to filter through that information without an individual checking of each single file.
I think it's also important to bring up the distinction between archivist and curator, because I think most archivists don't see themselves as curators. We're not there to curate the records. Obviously, we have to make some selections for practical reasons, but other than that, we don't want to make assumptions about what's going to be important or interesting in the future.
But also, I think there is a distinction between what the architect finds is an important key moment in a design process. Absolutely. And what archivists, curators, historians find, after all, a very key moment.
Oh, I agree.
So, I mean, I agree with you that you have to collaborate. I will explain the project at CCA, but it is very, very, very time consuming. But at the same time, I'm also, that's optimistic in fact, because ultimately it is also about other people to explore and to find other key moments. It's not easy in terms of digital, but it's, you also have to leave room for that.
So Martine, you're saying that the collaboration is obviously has to happen because you have to go into the firm to see what there is, but that in reality it has to be more than just that in order to ensure that we're getting as full as possible.
Yes, which is complicated because also quite often the architects don't really understand what we actually want or what we're after. So it's it takes a while before you're on the same page.
And do you think there's going to be a universal formula, or is it really going to be every time will probably be something different?
My feeling now is I will talk about this later on this afternoon, but we're investigating 25, let's say, very experimental projects. These are the most complicated ones. I have to say that alongside, we also receive more standardized, normalized archives. So I think there are two different things. Let's say there are the experimental projects. It's the same with the paper archives, basically. You have the experimental architects and where nothing is standardized, and you have the architects that ultimately are very standardized or work in a very consistent way. So it depends really. I mean, let's say the difference between the archive of Cedric Price and Peter Eisenman, that's the, let's say, the difference that you also will find in the digital archives.
Can I ask a question about the future? It kind of comes to me in a couple of different ways. Firstly, the sense in which we need to be able to cope with large numbers of files, and growing numbers of files, and the need to automate large amounts of stuff. There's also a question in my mind about why is it that CAD formats change so frequently? Why can we not rely? And it's not just because of AutoCAD, I'm guessing. It's to do actually with innovation in IT that means that those changes are for good reason, even if they give us difficulties down the line. We had a brief mention of the idea of a dark age, you know, that we're hearing from we really have some stuff that does, but it's not by any means what we need. And I wonder what your views would be on the future, therefore, given what your experience is now. Are we always going to be trying to chase some big innovation?
You know, I might just speak to what I hear from colleagues who are IT people, and the answer is that I think that the same question, because the software makers have totally different goals than we do, just totally different, and they really don't care about us, meaning that what we, the answer is yeah, we're always going to be kind of dragging along behind, and it does force collaboration. But I mean, the history is so short so far. It's what, you know, really 5 years that we've had very much. So, I mean, we do have to keep being flexible. And my hope is that the basic constructs, I think it's common sense and simplicity do tend to work over the long run. But the overall construct does allow for increasing complexities, and you know, I was showing you know, TIFF, JPEG, PDF, but you know, MOV, WAV files, you know, a lot of media files. So as there's more consistency, and I loved what Alex was saying about the I mean, it's not just me. I just say that's just, you know, the 600-page standard in my view is useless.
So the 600 parts, each of which
600 parts. Oh, it's even worse.
Each of which may be 600 pages. I mean, it's enormous.
So what I see is kind of the overall framework. I think that we're sort of seeing how it's going to come together, but it does have the capability, as there's more sophistication, of taking that in and absorbing it. And I think that over time that will happen. But you know, they got to get their act together first. So
I also think that raising awareness of the issue is important, because, I mean, architects 10 years ago didn't talk about this. It was the archivist's problem. But now they're aware that, oh my God, we need to put our act together as well if we want this. So raising awareness is a slow process, but I think it's a process that is well worth it.
Also, because we're speaking with the software companies because of the project at the moment, and it's very clear part of it is innovation, but also part of it is making money.
Yeah,
They make
absolutely.
money by selling new products, so which is fair enough. But you have to find, there's always in every company, there's a few people that are the real, let's say they have a kind of a historical motivation in what they do. And once you find these, you have the right people.
I wonder if I could kind of follow up a little bit that thought. I mean, so is the file going to be our problem in the future? I mean, I wonder, well, maybe this is one for you, Alex, rather more. I wonder whether actually what we're talking about here are complex integrated things, environments, rather than files that we're going to need to manage, which includes all that other stuff as well, by the way, all the email, all the documents, all the photographs. And I wonder whether actually our focus in the future will have to move towards more to do with environmental stuff rather than individual files. What do you think, Alex?
Yes.
Good answer.
Yes, I think we are going to be seeing an evolution more towards integrated systems that we're having to preserve wholesale, and the linkages are going to become more and more important. So yes, it's a case of once you solve one problem, then another 5 pop up. But you know, that's usually the case with digital curation.